Again, for you people who just walked in, my name's Michael Stachnik, Program Manager at the Elk Grove Historical Museum. And we're going to be talking today about burials and tomb designs and a little bit about local Chicago area cemeteries that are of interest. So burials appear to go back even pre-humanity. So there are several Neanderthal sites where it appears that the Neanderthals buried people in the graves and possibly with some grave goods. One of them that was confusing was one of them had like little pollen seeds in there, and they thought maybe there were flowers and this was the remnants of these flowers. Or other people speculated, well, there could have been like an animal burrow down into the grave and maybe squirrels or something had, taken grain down. So there's still some controversy about that, but generally they pretty much feel that they did bury their dead with honors. The more we learn about the Neanderthals, they're much more advanced than what they were thought of back in the 19th century when they discovered their first remains. Whoops. Now over here we have Stone Age various burials, and there are various different types of burials which were done in Europe during the Stone Age. A lot of them involved mounds that they would build in, and you'll see burial mounds all over the world. So when we get closer to our own time period, I'll talk a little bit about the mound builders here in North America. And in Europe, you'll see a lot of these sort of designs. You see these stones, and actually I think I could jump up ahead and I'll show you the picture so I could make the comparison with it. So you can see this. So this is a burial. This is a megalith, so meaning large stone blocks, the dolmen. And this is kind of the skeleton that's left behind. So people would be buried in this chamber here in the center, but it didn't look like that. That's been eroded down. So originally what they would do is you could see, dig a trench and then pull the stone over, get it in an upright position, dig another trench, pull the other stone over. Then they would fill the area around here with dirt and gravel, and then drag another heavy block, and these blocks were hundreds, if not in some cases thousands of pounds, over the top, and it would be covered all over with dirt. And then there would be a passageway built into these chambers. So you'll see these all over in France. You'll see them in England and Wales and Scotland and Ireland. And it appeared that the humans in that area had been building these types of tombs for about 3,000 years. Come on here. Okay, so there's this one over here. This one was built 3200 BC in Ireland. So given enough time, the sand and dirt and gravel, whatever they used to cover it, would eventually be eroded away, and that kind of leaves the skeleton of the original tomb, showing it that way. Now everybody's familiar with the ancient Egyptians and their pyramids, probably the most impressive burials in the world. My wife and I just got a chance 2 years ago to visit Egypt. It was a phenomenal tour, I must admit. We stood right at the bases of the Great Pyramids. This is like the height of pyramid designs. They're on Plateau of Giza. And the Egyptians did a lot of other types of tombs. Earlier on, they have the mastaba, which was meant bench. And these were kind of rectangular sort of burials. If you go to the Field Museum, they have a reconstruction of one that you could go down into. So the burial would be down inside. And then later on, there was the famous architect Imhotep. And for his pharaoh, he came up with the idea of like taking these and stacking them up. So he came up with a step pyramid. And then several pharaohs after that, they came up with the first slab-sided pyramids. So this is all from the Old Kingdom. And then later on, the Egyptians would change the way they would bury their people in the Valley of the Kings. They would start hiding the tombs because a lot of these people would see it and they thought, well, if they build it so monumental, they'd say, oh, God, we can't go in there. But then that was all, people said, wow, I wonder what's inside there, and they would break in. So then they started to hide tombs, but they still would find those as well. Now over here we have which may be the most fascinating tomb in the world, if they ever uncover it. This is the mausoleum of the first emperor of China. So this gentleman united China, and he wanted to live forever. So he talked to like his physicians at the time, and what they were giving him was mercury, because mercury is a metal, but as we all know, it's a liquid. So gee, isn't that very mysterious? So there must be some unique properties about something that behave that way. So it's probably good to make you live forever. So they were giving him mercury. And then towards the end of his life, he was dying from mercury poison. And they said, oh, you don't look too good, Emperor. Here, let's give you some more mercury. And eventually he passed away. Now, the tomb has not been excavated, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute. But what the stories say is he's buried inside there. There's also supposedly a huge map of China from his time period when he united all the lands of China. And it's got rivers, which are supposed to be mercury. So it sounds like they've built a large, maybe, I mean, envision something about as big as this room, and then rivers carved into some material, and then they poured mercury in there. Well, the Chinese government is kind of leery about excavating this because they have done some tests around the soil, and there is mercury in the soil. So that's one thing. The other thing is archaeology constantly changes. People think it's stagnant. It's not a stagnant science. It's constantly developing. They have new techniques such as ground penetration radar, where they could actually get a pretty good idea what's under the soil without digging it up. And the thing about an archaeological site is even if you carefully excavate it and preserve the material, when you've excavated, you've destroyed it. So the Chinese government kind of want to wait for some future time period when maybe some other new technology is developed that allows them to excavate it and excavate it safely. But you could see the size of this mound that the emperor is buried in. Now excuse me? The mound is the tomb? The mound is the tomb. Yeah, there is a burial inside of it. We're not quite sure. There might be a structure under there. Probably is, like the stone tools from the Megalith period where I showed you they had the stones. So there's probably something in there, and then this dirt was put on top of it. I mean, it is phenomenal in size. It's I believe the base of it is even bigger than the pyramid of Cheops on the Giza Plateau.
White structure, or is it all?
It's this whole thing, this whole mound. Oh, here, I got it.
I'm sorry.
I got it. No problem. And I have a laser beam. I forgot all about this. Nobody, like I said, nobody knows exactly what's inside there. There has to be some internal structure, especially if there's this large map of China in it. Now he's become famous, and you've probably seen this a lot, because right next to this mound are these Terracotta Warriors that were buried. So like other people, ancient peoples, they felt if they buried grave goods with them that these would be used by the spirit of the person in the afterlife. So it said that he probably felt that these statues would protect him, this army would protect him in the afterlife. These are fascinating in that the faces are all different. So the speculation is that the artisans who built this, that they actually used the models of his actual living men and then made each gentleman's face copied on these statues. So, and the other thing is, see how gray it is? When they first excavated this, they were all in color. And the paint, within a couple of days of excavating, the paint just started, when it hit the weather, it started to flake off. So, but if he has this next to the tomb, can you imagine what's inside that mound? So, Okay, now we're going to talk about our own country once I get my bearings here on this. Okay, we want down, down is forward, okay. So over here we're going to talk a little bit about here in North America. So we had native people here were called the mound building culture. Mound building culture is just a big catch-all. It actually involves several groups of people. Some were the Adena people who were building mounds going back maybe about 500 BC, possibly even earlier in North America. Then after them were the Hopewell peoples who inhabited much of the Midwest from about 500 BC to 500 AD. So when I took a class on archaeology studies in the 90s, I was actually excavating a Hopewell site on the Kankakee River for part of my classwork. And then after them, the height of these cultures were called the Mississippian culture. So these native people built all kinds of mounds. These are domed, some of them were flat topped, some of them had an arch on the top of it. And these mounds were used for a variety of different purposes. Some of them had temples on the top, some of them had living quarters for the aristocracy, and a lot of them were burial mounds. And these mounds a lot of times would be added on over centuries. So over here, these were probably two smaller mounds in this rendition here. And then when they buried this person, they covered it more. Then they added somebody here and covered it more. Then they added people here and covered it more. So these mounds would build over time. And these became very popular in the early 19th century as the country was expanding outward. And we've seen these phenomenal large mounds and structures, and we always thought the natives were not able to do that. You know, they're too primitive, supposedly. And so they came up with wild ideas that it was the lost tribe of Israel or something else like that came out here. But now, you know, people realize these were built by the native peoples. And so this picture here is from the early 1800s, and it shows, you can see some people from Garbanet and probably using slaves, excavating in here looking for treasures in these burial mounds. So here in Illinois, there were actual cities. We had the largest one here near St. Louis called Cahokia. So Cahokia, the height of Cahokia, which was that third period of these Mississippian cultures, is the Mississippian culture, Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippian. Their height of advancement was 1000 AD. So, you know, about 500 years before Columbus comes here. The city of Cahokia, which is just across the river from St. Louis, and indeed part of this urban center spilled over to St. Louis. There were several mounds in St. Louis, which as St. Louis developed and also have done in Illinois, they would excavate these mounds for the farming and that. Right now, St. Louis only has one mound left. Anyway, one of these mounds, archaeologists have given it the number Mound 72. And here's an old newspaper article from St. Louis Daily Globe from 1909. Being a little sensational here, it says where human beings were sacrificed was in sight of St. Louis. So these people were executed and buried with what they believe was a ruler. So there's a gentleman who's buried in this mound. He has thousands of freshwater pearls that he's lying on a bed of these things. And it's kind of outlined in the shape of eagle. And there was this bird shape design that repeats itself in their culture. And so he's called the Birdman Burial. No one knows exactly what his status was. There's no written language from these people. He was probably, I'm assuming, the ruler of Cahokia when he passed away. And so they executed people and buried them in the same mound that he was in. Now, coming here on the East Coast as Europeans started to come in here, you see some of the tombstones which are used. So the early tombstones over here, this one's from the 1750s, you can see somewhat crude, you know, lettering isn't very well done. And this one over here is almost just a plaque over here. Later on, they got a little bit more ornate. Okay, and this is where the symbolism starts to come in. So over here you could see representing death, so you could see the skull and these wings over here. So later on, as we move further into the Victorian period, Victorians had all kinds of symbolism for everything. So you could look up there, like flowers. They had like all kinds of flowers. This rose meant this, a daisy meant this. You know, it might mean love, or it might be sorrow, or it might be remembrance. And so they did that. The gemstones, we're all familiar with gemstones, birthstones, and all that. A lot of this came from Victorian period. So with the graves, it's kind of the same thing. So over here is a typical Victorian concept here. So a lot of times if you had a child who passed away early, the tombstone would incorporate the imagery of a child. Another example of imagery are urns, okay? So the urns that we see here were actually, it was a tie-in in the Victorians' mind between them and classical Greeks. So Victorian period in the United States, people usually didn't do cremations, but the ancient Greeks did, and a lot of times there were urns used. But this was a way for Victorians to say that I'm a sophisticated person, I'm a knowledgeable person, I know about the history of the ancient Greeks, you know, the connections between our two countries. They're the founders of democracy, this is democracy, so I like to do that. So they take the urns, so a lot of times that's why you'll see urns in here. And then some of the urns are incorporating other imagery. Over here you could see a willow tree. So if you go to our Elk Grove Cemetery, I give a tour there one Sunday a month in October. Unfortunately, I already did it a couple weekends ago. And we have, on the back of one of the tombstones, there's a willow tree on it. So, you know, the branches are hanging down, so it's kind of sad, and so hence the name, the design of that. And then another symbolism that is used are broken columns. So broken column meaning a life that's broken. Not always, but sometimes these were used on younger people, so a life ended too soon, so they'll have that. They can be just a vertical piece with the indication that the tops have been broken off, or like this one over here, blended into this woman's headstone. So you have the column here, and like if the broken part broke off there. Just like the urns that I showed you earlier, this also ties into the Greco-Roman time period. So again, this was a way for Victorians to say, oh, I have, you know, again, I'm sophisticated, I know about ancient history and symbolisms of these people, and so I have money, because these things did cost money for, just like today, if you want to do something like this, it's going to cost a lot more than the regular headstone. And so they went ahead, and if they had the money and sophistication, they would incorporate some of these ancient symbols. Now, I'm going to start talking about cemeteries. So for over 20 years, my wife and I lived in the Beverly Hills area of Chicago. If you're not familiar with it, it's the southwest side of the city. So it runs from about 87th Street all the way down to about 127th Street. When you get down to about 127th, it's the town of Blue Island. So it's actually on this ridge, which is the highest elevation in the city proper. It's 60 feet above the surrounding floodplain. It's remnant of an ancient glacial moraine. And because there's a lot of sand in that, and it's a high elevation, people built these cemeteries there in the late 19th century. So a lot of times when a spot is chosen for a cemetery, people would like to do it on a high ground because that's more of a place of honor, higher up on the hill rather than down in the valley. So a lot of burial cemeteries are put on a high ground. If it's not a real high hill, I mean anywhere where there's a little bit of a higher elevation, they'll do that. Also, in some cases here in the Midwest, a lot of these mounds were built by the actions of the glaciers going back 1 to 2 million years ago. They deposit a lot of sand and silt, just really fine particles. So it's a lot easier also to dig in the tops of these for burials. So that's one of the reasons I've done these. And there's tons of history here. I'm just going to talk about a few burials here. There's 3 cemeteries. I lived over here on 113th at Tallman. But north of 111th Street is the Mount Greenwood Cemetery. Then there's the Mount Olivet and the Mount Hope over here, as well as these others. Like I said, these cemeteries were built in the 1870s, 1880s in the area. And they actually had, there's still train tracks on either side of these going right now. Actually, it's in here, between like Western and the cemetery and in this area. There's sets of tracks going in there. And back in the late 19th century, what they used to have is they would have like a funeral car that you could rent. Say you lived in a city and somebody passed away, and maybe you had family connections out here, so you wanted them buried out here at these cemeteries. So these railroad cars would come out, and they're not there anymore, but they used to have train stations here with sidings where you could unload a coffin from the train and take them into these burial sites. There was also, later on, when they came up with like powered streetcars in Chicago, they had streetcar tracks going all the way out down to here. So I grew up in Pilsen, and in the 60s as a kid, my parents moved out to Hickory Hills, which is near like Justice, Illinois. It's on the southwest suburbs in that area, Summit and that. And there's a big cemetery over there, Resurrection, that a lot of my family's buried in. And it's gone, but the kitty corner from there used to have a restaurant there called the Landmark Restaurant. And that building that and they tore it down and put in a stupid gas station. But the building originally, from the turn of the last century, it was a place for the streetcars to turn around. So the streetcars would come to that building to unload the coffins, and then they would be put on a wagon and taken another quarter mile or so to the Resurrection Cemetery, and the streetcars would turn around in that building and go back into the city. So that's how they were accommodating things before the automobile. Now, okay, we're going to let me back up. I think we all know who that was. Okay, so the burials that I'll be talking about are just Mount Olivet. I could do a whole program just on these 3 cemeteries, but I had to cut off somewhere. So Mount Olivet has Catherine OLeary, who we all know as Mrs. OLeary of Chicago Fire fame. So she is a woman that legend claims that her cow, she went out there and was milking the cow, and it knocked over the kerosene lantern and started a fire and burned down her barn. But it later turned out that it was just a reporter at the time came up with the story. Also, the Irish were kind of looked down upon by others in Chicago at that time, so they said, oh, we could pick on the Irish, and that's where the story came about. We don't want to go too much in it, but currently people have investigated it, and about 20 years ago, when I was the director of the Ridge Historical Society in Beverly, they had investigated, and they think they know the gentleman who came and actually started the fire. There's a gentleman who they think may have come there to steal milk from the barn and had a lantern or something when it came in there, and then they believe he accidentally set the fire. The reason being, later on, is he said, oh, I came there to try to help out, but some reporters from modern newspapers, what they did is they had these Sanborn maps, which were maps done by insurance companies. They were everything specifically drawn on these maps, because before photography was very extensive and mapping, you had to know what was there. So if something burned, you could tell, yeah, I had this here, or I didn't have this here. So they looked at it, and from where Mrs. OLeary's house was at, and her barn, and where this gentleman was like 2 blocks over, there was like a 2-story building, and they figured that he couldn't have seen the fire until much after it really got it going. So that's one of the reasons that is. But she was affected by this, and it depressed her for her entire life. Now, she didn't have a lot of money, but her son was actually big in Chicago illegal activities. He had a illegal gambling hall in the city of Chicago. And this was just before the period of Capone, who we'll be talking about. So this is like the early teens. And I looked into, I haven't found it, but I'm assuming it was his money that paid for this very elaborate memorial to his mother. You know, they probably used money from his funds from his business. And again, this one has, remember we talked about that urn over here. So this is, if you go to the cemetery, you go right in the gate and it's off to the right. Now another person who is buried in Mount Olivet is, and I'm sorry, I got cut off there. So this is James Joseph Bell we'll be talking about. And he, James Joseph Bell, actually came on the site of the Custer battle. So the 2 days after Custer's 7th Cavalry was wiped out by Sioux and Cheyenne Native people, the unit that he was with came there. And that's why, so I have this picture of the Battle of Little Bighorn. This is Red Horse, this is one of the Native people, so they actually did a picture talking about the battle. So John Joseph Bell came there with his unit, and the general in command of his unit asked for 3 volunteers to ride to try to get reinforcements and to let them know what had happened to Custer. So Bell and 2 other Union soldiers, well, this was after the Civil War, volunteered and rode. It took them 3 days to get over to, let's see, I think it was Wyoming. So on December 2nd, 1876, the 3 men were given Congressional Medal of Honor. So James Joseph Bell, who's buried there in Mount Olivet Cemetery, he was given the citation over there, and it reads, quote, "carry dispatches to General Crook at the imminent risk of his life," unquote. So, but I found that he's buried there. It's a fascinating cemetery. There's really interesting people in there. And then we have good old Alphonse Capone. So Capone, who everybody's familiar with from pop culture and films and everything else, was head of the South Side mob in Chicago. And so when he passed away from advanced syphilis on January 25th, 1947, he was buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery. So this is the tombstone that's in Mount Olivet, okay? So he was originally buried there. He's not there anymore. So he was buried there, and next to him was his father and one of his brothers were buried. So the 3 gentlemen were buried there, and which is common in Italian funerals. There was actually photographs of them. These 2 discs had photographs. I don't know if this was a photograph, if either of these was Capone. They might have been one the brother and one the father. But that was very common, but you could see that they were stolen from here. You could see back this other burial behind here. It has nothing to do with Capone's, but you could see another one here. So as I walked around here, there were a number of these images. So around the turn of the last century, that was somewhat common. So anyway, the tomb was being vandalized. Obviously, you can see this was stolen off of there. So about 3 years after he passed away, his body, as well as his father's body and his brother's body, were relocated over here and reinterred at Mount Carmel Cemetery. So located near the Expressway, Eisenhower, at Wolf and Roosevelt Roads. So you can see this new memorial built for the Capone family in general, and there are several Capones buried out here. And so you could see Capone's burial site over there. So Capone isn't the only person of organized crime buried at Mount Carmel. So you have a lot of his fellow gangsters are buried there. So you see Al Capone over here, brother Frank Capone, another brother Ralph Capone, and you see Sam Giancana, who was just killed more recently, I believe it was about 1976, he was assassinated in his home in River Forest. The Gina brothers, who were Well, they were fighting kind of they were trying to be a go-between. They were taking sides with the North Side mob and the South Side mob, and it didn't end up good for most of them. They're buried there. Jake Lingle, a murdered journalist and mob associate. Jake's an interesting guy. So Jake was gunned down. He was walking down by the Central Station in Grant Park. You know, the trains, if those of you have been there, the trains are sunk below the ground level so that they're not obvious. You know, that was an idea to make it look cleaner. So he was on the north end of it going through the passage going to the train, and someone walked up and shot him in the back of the head. So Jake worked for the Chicago Tribune. So Chicago Tribune says, oh my God, they can't shoot one of our journalists, our seekers of the truth and all this stuff. So they had this big thing, and McCormick, who was ran the newspaper at the time, he put out, says, I'll pay so much money, we'll find out who his murderer is. Well, as other reporters investigated, they found out that Jake had a little home, but then he had another vacation home. He would drive around fancy cars. He had high-cost suits. He had another set of rooms in the Stevens Hotel, which is just south of the Chicago Auditorium building. And it turned out that people would come in to him, ask for favors. He was actually a go-between Capone and people who wanted Capone to do stuff for him. So people would go to Jake and say, hey, I need this done, and I give you this. And well, it turned out what historians believe is he was probably taking a little bit of money from Capone and put it in his own pocket. Capone probably had him bumped off. And then we have Machine Gun Kelly, who is one of the people that they think might have taken part in the St. Valentine's Massacre. You have Frank Nitti, from all of those who remember the Untouchables show. You know, Frank Nitti was took over after Capone went to jail, although Frank Nitti actually was probably more of a figurehead and ended up shooting himself in the head after the Second World War because the things were getting hot for the mob, and they said, you're going to have to spend time in prison. We're going to throw you to the authorities. And he was claustrophobic and said, I can't do it. I can't do it. So he went down railroad tracks and shot himself. And then there's O'Banion, who Capone's guys gunned down in his flower shop across the street from Holy Name Cathedral. And the last one to point out is Jaime West, who was actually Polish. And he took over, after O'Banion was killed, he took over the mob. And then he was gunned down by Capone associates crossing the street near the flower shop. And so they shot him down from a second or third story window, and bullets that killed him and his other, there was about 3 or 4 guys gunned down. Bullets actually hit the cornerstone of Holy Name Cathedral. So there used to be bullet holes in there a long time. The church finally got rid of it because it was attracting too much unwanted attention. Now, another interesting burial in Chicago is the Douglas tomb. So here we see Stephen Douglas, who won the famous debates and the election for state senator, running against Abraham Lincoln in 1858. So even though he worked to win the election away from Lincoln, when Lincoln became president and the Confederacy went ahead and declared war on the North, he decided to support the Union and supported Abraham Lincoln 100%. Unfortunately, he dies in the Tremont Hotel in Chicago from, we believe, typhoid. And so he passes away in 1861, the same year the war starts. So at that time, people were trying to raise money for a fancy burial for him, but it was the war and things were very hectic, so nothing got off the ground until much, much later. So they eventually, in 1881, some more money was put into the pot, and they built this large memorial to him and burial. So this is on Lakeshore Drive. So this is like about a mile south of McCormick Place. So if you're going along the outer drive and you look into the city, you'll see the top of his memorial there. Of because he owned all this land over there. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about this a little bit later. We'll also talk about Camp Douglas, which was also on Douglas's property. But anyway, Douglas was buried here in the base of this column over here. Very, very elaborate burial.
Is his body still there?
Yes, yes, it is. It's interesting. It's like a gated area around it and a gate to get in there. The last I haven't been. Oh my God. I probably have been there in about 35 years, but anyway, last I went there. Now, we're going to talk about the Chicago City Cemetery, which is Lincoln Park. So before Lincoln Park was Lincoln Park, it was the City Cemetery. So here you can see Lake Michigan over here, going east, going north up here. So here's the cemetery. So it came down here to start about North Avenue, going upward. North Avenue was called North Avenue because at one time that was the actual northern end of the city. So before the city expanded outward. And I should have asked earlier, can everybody hear me, by the way? I hear I'm talking away, and can you hear me? Okay, good. So they built a fence around this pretty much on the north end to keep out like goats and chickens, because back then, 19th century people were still could have livestock on their property. So that was a rendering of a design for, it was about a 6-foot fence which went around a big chunk of this cemetery. And then this is some early designs showing you some of the property around here. Here's the outer drive. And there were several cemeteries in there. There was a Catholic cemetery in there. There was also Potter's Field in there for the poor, as well as the Journal City Cemetery. So thousands and thousands of people were buried here. And what happened was there was a gentleman by the name of Rusk, a doctor. He was head of like Chicago sanitation about 1850s, before the Civil War. And he said this wasn't very healthy because when they were burying people in what's now Lincoln Park, the water table was close to where you're digging. So a lot of times if they got too close to the lake, when they were digging, they'd get down about 4 feet and the graves would fill up with water. There were some reports supposedly of graves after heavy rainstorms, if they're too close to the shoreline, actually washing out into the lake. So he said this is very unhealthy for us. You know, we're going to have cholera and typhoid. In medical treatment at that time, they still weren't sure of how germs function and how diseases were created. A lot of our modern science just, you know, starts pretty much around the First World War and after, when we get antibiotics in. But anyway, they did realize that was an unhealthy situation. So just around the end of the Civil War, they decided to close down the city cemetery, and they started to remove people who were buried here to other cemeteries, a couple of which we will talk about in just a moment. Now, this is interesting over here and chopped off the top of it, but this is a memorial to David Kenson. He died in Chicago in 1852. Now, this gentleman here claimed that he was a survivor and had been at the Boston Tea Party, that he supposedly fought with George Washington, and people figured out if he was that old, that when he died, he had been something like 118 years old. And basically, it turns out he was a self-promoter. So he liked people's attention. He made all the stuff up. None of it was true. It appears he may have fought in the War of 1812, which is many years after the Revolutionary War. Definitely couldn't have been around for the Boston Tea Party. But when he died, his funeral was the biggest in the city at that time, and thousands of people came to see him laid to rest. So they put this memorial to him. This is right off, when you're walking along Clark Street, this is right off the sidewalk there in the area. So then they didn't remove all the burials from Lincoln Park. So this is the Conch tomb over here. This one is where, if you've been there, north of North Avenue, if you're going north on Lakeshore Drive and you take the exit there into Lincoln Park, you go right around past it. And on this end over here is the Chicago Museum, formerly the Chicago Historical Society. So anyway, he's buried over here. People wonder why his mausoleum was left behind. Speculation is that a couple of ideas. One is that he was fairly well off and that his family may have paid a couple bucks under the table of the city to leave him in there. Other people said that, well, this was such an elaborate mausoleum, it'd be too hard to disassemble this thing and move it somewhere else. So it's still there. And amazingly, people don't know if there's actually anybody buried in it. So it's said that he's buried there with several family members, and he also was the owner of the famous Tremont Hotel. Remember I talked about, although he didn't own it when he died before Douglas died, but he owned the Tremont Hotel, and supposedly there was a guest from the Tremont Hotel supposedly buried in his mausoleum here. We just don't know. But it's one of the few burials which are remaining there, but there are others. So when they did an expansion of the Chicago History Museum, sometime in the 90s, they actually uncovered some more remains over there. And every so often, if they do some project, put in a new sewer pipe or somewhere, they'll still uncover remains. I mean, there were thousands of people buried here. Some of the people, especially in the Potter's Field, it's kind of hard to remember where everybody's at. Several graves are unmarked. So there's probably a number of people still buried in Lincoln Park. Another cemetery we'll talk about here is Rose Hill Cemetery. So this is William Boyington. He was the architect of this entrance gate for Rose Hill Cemetery up at 5800 North Ravenwoods Avenue. So if you look at his design for the cemetery entrance gate, does it remind you of any buildings in Chicago? Water Tower, exactly, because he is also the architect for the Water Tower. So that kind of Gothic revival design with the battlements on it and the towers and the pointed arch windows and all that, he kind of copied the same design over here. Probably the same stonework. So a lot of these buildings that you see, they're made out of what they call Athens marble, which is actually just limestone, and a lot of it was quarried in Joliet. So, but they wanted to doll it up, so they called it Athens marble. But yeah, a lot of it's just plain old limestone. So he designed the gate. This is lived from 1818 to 1898. Circa 1860, that's this picture here of him is about 1860. So that's just before the year before the war started. And he's also buried in Rose Hill Cemetery, as are many famous people, too numerous to count. There's a lot of Civil War veterans, there's a lot of generals buried in here. And I think it's still functioning. I haven't been there in probably about 30 years. But when you go through this gate, off to the right, there's a doorway. I mean, this is a wide building. And there was a little Civil War museum, just a little one. I mean, it's just about as big as this space here. And I think someone told me that it's still open over there. Now, there is a large mausoleum. The largest mausoleum in Chicago is here in Rose Hill. So this is the Rose Hill Mausoleum. And a lot of famous people are buried in the Rose Hill Mausoleum. Most of it is made out of marble. And this burial over here, and I'm sorry that, I don't know why that chopped the top off of there. But this is John Graves' shed from Shed Aquarium. So this is the philanthropist who gave money for that. And so you could see his name and memorial over here. So there's big doors. A lot of times these are bronze doors with intricate carvings and things of that nature here, and there's these passageways around here. So a lot of people, these people are probably nowhere near as wealthy as he was, but still probably fairly well off to have a burial like that. And then another person who's buried in the Rose Hill Mausoleum is Montgomery Ward. So when's the last time someone ordered something from Ward's catalog? I can try to remember when they folded up. But anyway, Montgomery Ward's was actually kind of a contemporary to Sears, and actually I believe Ward's got his start a little bit before Sears. Made a ton of money from the idea of a catalog. So I kind of think he was like the Amazon Corporation today. That was Montgomery Ward. So he is buried there. So his, you can see his name in here, and you could see the intricate carvings in the doorway. Now Ward's is interesting. Besides being fabulously wealthy, there was a Ward's skyscraper on Michigan Avenue overlooking Lincoln Park, somewhere in the vicinity, I don't remember exactly, but somewhere in the vicinity of the Art Institute. And sometime, I believe in the late 1890s, I forgot, he had a second in command or something. I don't remember what the guy's name was. Say it was Smithers or something like that. So he's looking out the window at the lakeshore, and he went up to this guy and said, "Smithers, that's a damn shame. Do something about it." So what he was looking out on was back at that time in the 1880s, and after the Chicago fire, the lakeshore was just a big dump. There were a lot of homeless people there. There were shacks over there. Garbage was dumped over there. Indeed, a lot of Grant Park was created after the Great Chicago Fire. So when the Chicago Fire ended, you've seen probably all those pictures of all those stones and melted railroad ties. And well, what did they do with all that stuff? Well, they loaded on wagons, they took it to the shore, and they threw it in the lake. And then eventually the dirt built out on it. So if you go anywhere in metropolitan Chicago from the North Shore all the way to the South Shore, none of the lake shore is original. All of it's been extended outwards to varying degrees. So anyway, after that, he went for about a 20-year court case. He was fighting in the courts to try to save the lake front for the masses. He said that this should be kept forever neat and clean, and for working class people to go out there and have some place to recreate. And he paid millions of dollars to fight the courts to get that done. Eventually, they did pass laws. There are regulations. There were eventually other buildings built there, like the Art Institute itself. And I've looked into it. One of the things that I read is that nothing's supposed to be built east of Michigan Avenue unless, like, all the tenants along Michigan Avenue vote on it. So I'm not quite sure how accurate that is. I'm still trying to look into it. But the laws that he worked to help get passed pretty much stopped any other major construction in Grant Park, so it remains a park. Oops. Okay, and the next one is Oakwood Cemetery, 1035 East 67th Street, south side of Chicago. A lot of famous people buried here as well. One of them is Mayor Harold Washington, the first black mayor of Chicago, is buried there. You can see over here the burial of Jesse Owens. Jesse Owens was a black man who ran up against the Nazis in the Olympics just prior to the Second World War, and really PO'd Adolf Hitler by beating all of his men. So he's buried there. Again, a lot of Civil War veterans. So a lot of these cemeteries here in the city are quite old. Rose Hill is the oldest existent cemetery. The city cemetery predates it, but again, remember, it doesn't exist anymore. And so a lot of them have Union dead, and we'll talk about in a minute, also Confederate dead up here. So these are Union monuments, and if you look at them, it almost looks like a sheriff's badge design. So that was kind of the design, I believe, was put together by the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, which is the veterans organization for Civil War veterans. And so all these tombs are standardized. And you actually, if you want to get a bit better picture of it, on the foam core board that I have at the back, the Civil War veterans buried in Elk Grove Cemetery, it shows you that design work. So you'll see those in Oakwood Cemetery as well as others where they have Civil War dead. Now here we have Camp Douglas, 1864. Here's the lake shore over here, and this was about 28 28th Street, 23rd Street. This is about 36th, 38th Street, somewhere about there. Cottage Grove used to go through here. This was all owned by Senator Douglas, so he had all these grounds. And he had a big home there and stuff. So when he died, as far as I could find out, his family allowed them to put a camp here. So Camp Douglas, named after Douglas, was originally used to train Union soldiers before they went to fight the Confederacy. So for a couple of years, it was just a training camp. And then 2 or 3 years into the war, as we started to capture more and more Confederate prisoners, they needed some place to put them. There were multiple POW camps in both the North and the South. So Camp Douglas was one of the larger ones, not the largest. The entranceway was over here facing into the lake. These barracks originally had Union troops, and that's where they stayed when they were under training before they went to fight in the South. And then when the Confederates were brought up here, this is where they kept them. You could see the Central Railroad tracks going right over here. And again, today, this is probably Lakeshore Drive, and the lake's out here. Again, this has been filled in. Anyway, unfortunately, a lot of Confederates, and in fact, even some of the Union guards died here from various diseases. Cholera, a big one. And this camp is sometimes called the Andersonville of the North. So there were several camp commanders over the history of the Civil War who were here, some better than others, some of them a little bit more sadistic than others. So one of the things they used to do to Confederate soldiers for punishment is they told them riding the horse. What riding the horse was is you had a beam, a wooden beam, which is square, and they would prop it up on like legs, hence kind of looks like a horse, and they would get the guy to straddle this thing and then sometimes give him like 2 buckets of sand, and then he had to stay there for however the commander thought, maybe a couple hours. Well, your legs is shaped this way, not this way. So the top of that beam's cutting into your upper thighs, you know, as you're just sitting there on this thing. Approximately 4,000 Confederate troops died here. So when they died, there was, and I don't remember exactly where in here. It looks like it's in this drawing here. It's probably further over here. There was a cemetery right outside the gates where they buried some of the Confederates there. But just like the city cemetery in what's now Lincoln Park, storms would blow water in here and would wash the graves out into the lake again. So let's get to that. After the war, they took them to some of the burials to Oakwood Cemetery. So this is a memorial done by some people from the South in the late 19th century. They raised money for this thing. If you go there, these are the names of the 4,000 or so Confederates who are believed to be buried here in a mass grave. There are some cannons here at the corners, and at one of these cannons, there's a row of graves. There's about a dozen or so Union troops who are guards at Camp Douglas, and they're buried there next to the charges that they used to oversee. Now, this is an interesting one there. This is a memorial of Carl Cramer here. So Cramer, this was a memorial to him. He was working on a train, and remember that the train was up state of the post. So he was trying to slow down the train, and as another train was approaching to prevent a head-on collision, and he tried to activate the brakes to slow it down. And he stayed in the engine, hanging on to the brake, pulling it, and the 2 trains eventually collided. He was killed in the collision, but as far as I remember, nobody else died. He's the only one that died. So the people who were passengers on his train, they raised money for this memorial to him. And This is the front, and if you go around the back side, that's this here. This is what it says there. So, sacred to the memory of Carl Cramer, who lost his life by saving the train at York, Indiana, July 27th, 1887. He was aged 37 years, 1 month, and 11 days. So, it's a very ornate memorial. You can see here, here's a drive engine from a steam locomotive. You can see it's broken, which actually kind of more represents death rather than the collision itself. And at the top, this is actually a stone representation of a smokestack from a steam engine. You could see a picture here of the engine, and so other track ideas. So here's in stone, here's the rails for the train that are built, carved into stonework, very elaborate. I'm going to throw out over here. There's another, behind his memorial, there's another urn over there as well. So very interesting memorial, and again, paid for by people whose lives he saved. Now, next cemetery is Woodlawn Memorial Park, 7750 West Cermak. And in there we have people from the Hammond Circus train wreck. So this was a train wreck occurred on June 22nd, 1918, during the last months of World War I. And what happened was there was 2 trains. One train was approaching the other one had the circus on it. So all the cars were loaded with circus performers and animals and things of that nature. And what happened was the engineer of the circus train actually fell asleep at the wheel. And so didn't activate brakes. I don't know if he activated them at all, but his train slammed into the back of another train. He actually survived. He was sent to courts. They were trying to convict him of charges like manslaughter. Anyway, so these trains at that time, a lot of them were made out of wood, and they had kerosene lanterns. So from the impact, if people weren't killed by that impact, the lanterns would fall down and it would set fire to the wooden cars. And so you could see 85 people died in this. Here it says 62 bodies taken from wreck, with only 24 of them recognizable. So just a horrific tragedy. And here at the cemetery, they're buried here at this thing called Shulmans League of America, or Shulmans Rest. So just before this accident occurred, this was an organization for performers, kind of like a union thing, and also, you know, you get like a credit union and stuff like that. And they had purchased this land just, I think just a few months before this tragedy occurred. So they took a lot of the people, because a lot of these circus performers were transients. And a lot of times they wanted some show name. Sometimes they didn't even know whose family they came from. And unfortunately, a lot of people were burned beyond recognition, so they didn't even know who they were. All they could make out sometimes it was a male or female. So they buried them in graves here, and they put these memorials. There's 2 of them. There's an elephant here, another one over here. They're not real big. I mean, the elephant's about that high. So, and then here's a poster from the circus. They continued on. They finally ceased operations in 1938. And then we're going to conclude with, and the lady up here in the front is well acquainted with it, Grayson Cemetery, ta-da! So Grayson Cemetery, to me, and it's just me, is probably the most interesting cemetery in the greater Chicagoland area, and probably one of the most fascinating places in the world, for a number of reasons. One is the tremendous amount of famous movers and shakers and people of history who are buried in Graceland, such as Alan Pinkerton from Pinkerton's Detective Agency. He's buried there. The supposed first woman detective, I believe, who worked for him, she's buried in a plot with other Pinkerton agents. But then also the architecture, as we'll see here towards the end, of some of the phenomenal memorials to especially the wealthy people are in there. So Grayson Cemetery was a recipient of some of the burials from the city cemetery in Lincoln Park. So when they removed them, this is one of the places they took them. Now, cemeteries back then were 19th century, early 19th century, going earlier, very dismal places. So if any of you have ever seen, there was one movie on Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart called Amadeus. So at the end of the movie, he died as a young man. So you see his family, and it's a dark, I think it was a rainy night, and they're taking the body, and it's in a coffin. He's in this coffin and that, and they're taking him to the cemetery. This is in Europe, not the United States. And then you think they're going to take the coffin off. Well, what happens is there's like a panel on the back of the coffin. They kind of lifted it up, and his body was wrapped up in a shroud, and it slides out almost like out of a dump truck and goes into a pit with a bunch of other bodies. And then the gravekeepers just take a couple of shovelfuls of lime to show on there, which helps break down the bodies. So that's what you had. The cemeteries, like in the 1600s, 1700s, they were smelly. It was not a place you'd know. Once you buried someone, you usually wanted to get out. Well, a lot of this started with Queen Victoria in England. So when her husband died, Prince Albert, if I remember, she had a big burial for him, and they started to change the appearance of cemeteries. So this was like the cemetery park movement, some people call it. So this is around the Civil War through the rest, well, up to this day, but a big amount of this through the Victorian periods. And they built these more park-like settings. So when they laid out Grayson Cemetery, you could see these nice curving streets. So if you have a carriage, you could ride through here. I told you already about the memorials, and we'll see some of those. There's a man-made lake in here with a little island. Daniel Burnham, the famous Chicago architect who did the Chicago plan in 1909, he's buried there. And they planted thousands and thousands of trees. So it's like a park. And in the late Victorian period, people would actually take a picnic lunch, and they would go up to Grayson and the other cemeteries like Rose Hill, and they would have a picnic lunch there, and it was a place for the middle class to go and recreate. So one person we'll talk about, probably the earliest death that's buried there, is John Kinsey. So John Kinsey bought this cabin from DeSalvo. DeSalvo was of Caribbean and black descent. He's a lot of times considered the first non-native settler in Chicago. This cabin was on the north side of the Chicago River, right next to where the Sun-Times building is at, and that area is called Pioneer Court. So he bought it from him, and then during the War of 1812, the Potawatomi natives wanted to drive out the white man who was infringing on their property. So they surrounded the fort, and eventually the people in the fort tried to leave to work their way eastward to get to another fort, I think in Indiana they were trying to get to, and the natives attacked and killed a lot of people. Well, Kinsey's family was saved because the natives felt that he treated them fairly as he was trading with them. So after the war, he was taken, if I remember, he was taken by the British and then eventually released, and he came back here and lived the rest of his life there. Well, when he died, he was buried in a cemetery outside the gates of Fort Dearborn. So that was one of our earliest cemeteries. Then when pretty much by 1850s, what was left of Fort Dearborn was obliterated. And so then they dug him up and moved him to the city cemetery, and they buried him over there. So then, as we know, they closed that cemetery down, so they picked him up third time, and hopefully he's got his final resting place at Graceland. So this limestone worn headstone is probably, I'm estimating that this was probably from the city cemetery, and when he was outside, in the little cemetery outside Fort Dearborn that existed, he probably just had like a wooden cross there. And then now there's a modern headstone here and this medallion for him. So he's buried there. And then here we have Dexter Graves' burial. He died in 1844, but like Douglas, his son raised money about 30 years later and had this memorial designed and built for him. This was designed by the famous sculptor Laredo Taft. So Laredo Taft, he had his studios on the Midway down by the University of Chicago. They're still there today, and they still do art classes out of there. He designed this phenomenal statue called the Fountain of Time that's in Washington Park. He designed this other statue right outside the grounds, the landscape grounds outside the Art Institute. So when you're going towards the front of it, it's on the right-hand side, set back against the wall. And it's several women, and they're pouring water, and it's representing the Great Lakes, the water from one lake going to the other. So he did that. And then he also did this huge statue, which some people call Black Hawk, in Western Illinois, and it's about 30 feet tall. So anyway, he designed this famous statue. He called it Eternal Silence, but everybody who comes and sees this just say they think it's death, representing death. And the metal has been allowed to weather into this green color, so you can just see the dark face inside there. So very somber looking, but very well designed memorial. Here we have George Mortimer Pullman. So Pullman made the famous Pullman palace cars. He started out early 1850s raising the street buildings in Chicago. Chicago was flooding all the time. So in the mid 19th century, they came up with the idea to raise all the buildings up, the hotels and the stores, and raise them up one story, build a new foundation, and then they built the streets up higher so they could have a place for the water to go. And so he made his first batches of money working on that. He would have huge teams of men surrounding these buildings, and with jacks, at a signal from him, they'd turn the jack a little bit, and these buildings would slowly work their way up. And when they got up one story high, then they would build new foundations. They did that because some of the early hotels, sometimes they had marble floors from Italy or chandeliers, and they didn't want that stuff all ending up in the basement, so it was cost efficient to raise it up. Then he took that money, he did a little mining out west. It actually made some money mining. And then before the Civil War, he was working with this other gentleman and came up with the idea of this elaborate palace car. So a railroad passage at that time was pretty bad. You sat on a hard bench. The windows were usually kept open in the summertime, so hot. The smoke from the engine would blow back into the windows. You're sitting on this rough bench, you're being jostled around. It wasn't a pleasant experience. So he came up with this plush car with velour seats and chandeliers inside it and all this fancy designs and curtains on the windows and all that. And it was so big and ornate that it wouldn't fit on a lot of the gauge railroad tracks at the time. So what happened is, unfortunately, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. And if you don't already know, when he was killed at Ford's Theater in Washington, they took him on a train trip back to Springfield. And at several major cities, including Chicago, they would stop with the president's body. And sometimes the heads of local government and business people would come on the train to see the president. Sometimes, like Chicago, Lincoln's body was removed and taken to a building on display for a day and then put him back on the train. Well, it's Abraham Lincoln as president. So George says, I'll tell you what, you could use my palace car. It's an appropriate thing for our martyred president. So they put him on there, and in some cases, supposedly, they would disassemble bridges in that because the car was kind of too big, and they opened up the thing to let this car go through. And then every time it stopped, people would go see the president's body, but you had all these people who were movers and shakers, and they'd look at this car, and they were awestruck, and they said, wow, this is very opulent. I'd like this way of travel. So he made all this money on his railroad cars. Anyway, he eventually had a town designed, which still exists on the south side of Chicago, around 111th and Cottage Grove. 111 was the dividing. South of it was the residential area for his workers. North was where they built the cars. And just this year, the U.S. Park Service opened up a museum in the old administration building. My wife and I went there. Very attractive. But in 1894, there was, up to that point, the largest depression that ever took place in the United States. A lot of people were out of work. And George, his whole town that he made, everything had to make a profit, including the church, the library. Everybody had to make a minimum of 7% profit. So he was struck by the depression and the loss of business. So what he did was he cut the wages of his workers, but he didn't cut their rent. So these people, if you were an average worker there, at that point you were making, depending on what you're doing, much of a craftsman, $40 to $60 a month, and your rent was about $7 to $8 a month. So he cut their income, but didn't. So they got very upset. So they went to Eugene Debs, who started the first railroad union in the United States. He grew up in Terre Haute, Indiana. He said, we would support you. Things stayed quiet in the town of Pullman, but this railroad strike went national. In other places it turned violent. Strikers would set fire to the cars and try to block the trains and things of that nature. And the business people, train people and other business people, well, hey, we can't have this anarchy. You got to do something. So they went to Grover Cleveland. He says, well, I can't put in the federal troops aren't supposed to be going in to the United States. They're for fighting, outside the country. So the businessmen went up to him and they said, what can you do? Oh, wait a second. The trains at that time carried the mail. So the strikers are interfering with the federal government by stopping the mail. Okay, that'll work. So we send in the troops. They're garrisoned all over the place. There's pictures of them. Troops garrisoned around this big arcade building, which was kind of one of the first mixed-use store-type buildings in the United States, which was part of Pullman. And the strike was broken. So several years later, Pullman passes away, and he remembers how people thought about him. And so he thought, hopefully no one's going to try and steal my body like there was an attempt on Lincoln's body after his death. So what happened when he finally passed away was with 1896. Sorry, 1897. So when he dies in 1897, what they did is they dug a huge room-sized hole in the ground, and then they took his coffin, they wrapped it in tar paper, they lowered it into this big hole in the ground. Then they took railroad ties and crisscrossed them on top of the casket and bolted them together. And then they poured concrete on top of that. And then they laid a little grass on top, and I forget, he's under one of these three. And then they put that slab under. So people says, hey, if there is a end of the world and a final calling, he's going to have a rough time getting out of there. But he was afraid of people stealing his body. So now the other person who's buried there is Potter Palmer. Potter Palmer, you may have heard of the Palmer Hotel, which still exists. It's downtown. There's actually an entrance on Wabash and the other entrance on State Street. Just one of that's about the fourth Palmer Hotel. Potter Palmer originally made his money as a real estate agent. He bought the land along what's now State Street. That's when most of the businesses were along Lake Street, and so he bought all this property. He built this big store in conjunction with Levi Letter, who built the Sears store, which is on South, if you're familiar with it, South State Street, still standing. And he also worked with Marshall Field as a young man, and they started this fancy store. And because they had this fancy store now on State Street, these other people said, wow, that's a fancy store. We want our store or our motel or whatever next to you. And he says, oh, okay, well, let's see. You want this land? You can buy this one from me, or this one from me, or this one, or that. So he owned most of the street, so he made most of the millions there, not from the hotel. And then this is his wife, Bertha Palmer, head of Chicago Society. She would collect French Impressionist paintings, not old paintings. These are when the French Impressionists were still alive and working. And she would go to France and buy these and had these in her home. So eventually, when they pass away, her home was finally torn down in the 1950s, and they took her art collection and they gave it to the Art Institute. So if you go to the Art Institute and look at the French Impressionist paintings, if you look down there, most of them are donated by the Palmer family. Anyway, when they finally passed on, they had probably the most grandiose burial there in Graceland. So there's two huge sarcophagi over here, and you can see it's very Greco-Roman design, which at the turn of the last century was very popular in the United States. So he's in one, she's in the other, and their children, when they passed away, they're in the floor. So like there's these big sarcophagus, and you walk along here, and there's a big slab, and it says which child is buried right over there. So this was designed, there it is in the wintertime. This is I thought it was very pretty, surreal sort of imagery with the snow there in black and white. So this was designed by McKim, Mead, and White. So they were probably the most popular architects in America at that time. And then last, we're going to finish up with Louis Henry Sullivan, the famous architect. Sullivan designed the Chicago Auditorium. When he was working on the Chicago Auditorium, his chief draftsman was Frank Lloyd Wright. So he was the mentor for Frank Lloyd Wright. And he did other fancy buildings. He did the old Carson Perry Scott store on State Street, which was, I think, originally, not Carson Perry Scott, but I think it was the Stevens department store originally. And did a lot of architecture and designs of early skyscrapers at the end of the 19th century. Unfortunately, he was an alcoholic and died pretty much penniless in a flop house on the south side of Chicago. And when he died, they still put his burial in Graceland, but he's buried right over here, and it's just like one of these little headstones. And next to it, so like it's there, he's buried there, and this thing's like about this far over. So friends and family of his raised enough money to have this built. And so you see this medallion, it's got this real characteristic, and we'll see more of it in just a little bit, characteristic of his organic design. It's for those of you who know Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau must have influenced him greatly. And then you see these squared off things which look like skyscrapers carved into there. So that's his own little burial. But he designed two tombs there. This is one of them. This is the Martin Ryerson tomb. And for this one, he blended Egyptian style. So here's the pyramid, and this rectangle is more like the mastaba, the earlier tombs that the pharaohs were buried in. And when they built pyramids, they would still build mastabas. They were usually for like lower ranking aristocrats in ancient Egypt. So, but very simplistic design. So Sullivan said, we're Americans, okay? So we live in America, we should have an American architecture. Why do you go to a bank and it looks like a Greek temple? So he did a couple of series of books on his philosophy of architecture, and he had one where there's two people walking along, a teacher and a student, and the teacher stops at one of the banks in Chicago on LaSalle Street and says, oh, look, someone plopped down this ancient temple here in Chicago, and we'll watch the people be coming out in togas, you know. And then his student says, no, teacher, that's actually a bank. And so he sarcastically, no, it can't be a bank. Anyway, so he wanted something devoid of European ornamentation and historical ornamentation and tried to create a new architecture. This is the back of the tomb. Very simplistic design, very neat, not a lot of heavy details on it, other than the slight references to the pyramid and mastaba. And that's not exact duplication of a mastaba, but very simplistic design, and that's what he was striving for. And the last one we'll show over here is the Elsa Getty tomb, built in 1890. And this tomb here in Graceland, there's a plaque on it, and architectural historians say this is the beginning of modern architecture. So in 1890, when this was built, and Sullivan had a design, if you look at it, there's no reference to any other historic time periods like a lot of other architecture was. We've seen Greco-Roman styles before. We've seen the Gothic revival, like in the Water Tower and the Rose Hill Cemetery entrance gate. This one is more geometric mass. And the design work is his floral designs, which is a lot, when you look at it close, it looks like intricate vines and things. But other than that, there's an arch, but it's not really a copy of any sort of Greco-Roman arch. Very simple base over here with blocks. You have the design work in here. But basically, it's a cube. Simple cube with a little bit of etching inside here and these ornate doors. And then we'll conclude with, this is the side window. And so you get a little bit closer look to it. So you can see it looks like leaves and vines in here. So a lot of what he took were concepts from nature. So again, this was his idea of a new American architecture. So thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.